Many organizations assume that moving to one of these providers automatically means they're covered from a resilience perspective. Can you unpack this misconception? Where do the real risks lie when the businesses rely too heavily on a single cloud ecosystem?
Gartner has done some studies around this. And what they have indicated is that only 25% of people know that the data that they put in a SaaS tenant or in a cloud tenant, responsibility for having that data and a copy of that data relies with the people consuming the service, not with the cloud provider. Only 25% knows that. So 75% of people believe that Microsoft or Amazon or Google or Salesforce or Okta or Entra ID, that they keep a copy of their data somewhere and forever, and that whenever something happens, they will be able to recover. But it's not the case. The SaaS provider or public cloud provider, they will guarantee that that service is up and running. But the data that you put in these SaaS applications or in the public cloud, that's your responsibility.
Hi, and welcome to Tech Transform, the podcast that explores how technology is reshaping business, data, and the world around us. I'm your host, Trisha Pillay, and in this episode, we're tackling a very critical topic that's often overlooked in cloud strategy conversations, and that is cyber resilience beyond the hyperscalers. As cloud adoption accelerates, organizations are increasingly dependent on a small number of hyperscale providers. But what happens when centralized systems face outages, ransomware, or security and privacy risks? To unpack this, I'm joined by Jan Ursi, Vice President of Global Channels at Keepit, a company known for its independent cloud architecture and focus on backup and recovery. Jan has worked closely with organizations navigating complex data protection challenges, helping them balance performance, compliance, and resilience in a cloud-dominated world. Jan, welcome to Tech Transformed.
Thank you, Trisha. Happy to be here.
So let's start off with this. Could you please tell us a bit about your role at Keepit and what led you to focus on independent cloud infrastructure and cyber resilience?
Sure. Yes. So I take care of the global partnerships strategy at Keepit, which is the strategy and the execution and the teams that are involved with bringing the Keepit goodness to all corners of the world through our partnerships, which is local distribution, local value-added resellers, managed service providers, but also other type of alliances like OEMs and ISVs. So you can already sense that Keepit is a company which is partner first, meaning that we will always work together with a local partner to bring the Keepit goodness to the end customers and government organizations. So the reason why I was attracted to Keepit and to the notion of independent cloud to take a copy of the data and store it somewhere in a secret location, which is unknown to anybody with zero sub-processors and so on, is because I've seen a growing demand around me from partners, but also from customers and government organizations for digital sovereignty, which means, yes, we want to leverage what is in the cloud in terms of SaaS applications that we consume as a service, which are typically built in these public cloud environments. The example of Monday, where Amazon had a major outage, is a good example, right? People were panicking because a lot of SaaS applications were affected. And some of the government and businesses out there, they needed access to that data to continue with their business or to at least have a minimal viable company going and continuing with operations. And that was impossible. If you put all the eggs in the same basket, you start to put a lot of risk in one place. And I was attracted to that thought of, hey, every region, Europe, America, Asia, they all have the right for digital sovereignty. Meaning, yes, we want to use the goodness of the cloud, but we also want to make sure that we keep a copy of the data in our region, in Europe, in the US, in Australia. And that's exactly what Keepit has been building, an independent cloud which is disconnected and air-gapped from these major cloud providers. That digital sovereignty is something that you see being demanded increasingly. And the reason is, of course, not only compliance, but also every nation state want to make sure that they can do good for their citizens and their businesses, even if there is tension in geopolitical relationships. So that's one element of it. And then the other element, Trisha, is the cybersecurity space. I believe that cybersecurity is in a big crisis at the moment, a really big crisis. All companies and public services companies out there have been investing in prevention, trying to keep the bad guys out, bigger walls, larger moats, even more firewalls, even more endpoint security, and so on. But they start to realize that even though they've invested in prevention so much, there's no avoiding to get hit at a certain moment. And what do you do then? How do you recover? So the whole shift from prevention to cyber resilience, where you think about, hey, I need to have a safe copy of my data somewhere untouchable, and I need to have access to that data. I need to be able to restore that data within hours, the moment that I'm hit by a large ransomware attack, for example. The move from prevention to resilience is also a move that I'm fascinated with. And also here at Keepit, that's our primary focus. How do we make companies more resilient? How do we make sure that the reliance on SaaS applications is not crippling their business the moment that something is going wrong with the data that is powering those SaaS applications? Those are the two things, digital sovereignty and the move from prevention to resilience.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that really shows the experience that you have. But when we talk about the hyperscalers, we're referring to, like you said, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, massive platforms that have so much power for today's digital economy, right? But many organizations assume that moving to one of these providers automatically means they're covered from a resilience perspective. Can you unpack this misconception? Where do the real risks lie when the businesses rely too heavily on a single cloud ecosystem?
Yes, Trisha, and let me tell you a story to provide an example on that. In 2020, which is not so long ago, it's maybe 5 years ago, an employee at KPMG accidentally deleted Microsoft 365 Teams data for 140,000 employees. So he was trying to adjust a retention policy, and he made a mistake. Instead of applying it to a single user, he applied it to a whole tenant, a whole group of users. And 140,000 people saw their Teams data disappear, some of the historic data, which is, of course, a painful moment. It's accidentally. However, a lot of people believe that when that happens, you just call Microsoft and they will automatically be able to restore it. But that's not the case, and that's a big misconception. Actually, Gartner has done some studies around this. And what they have indicated is that only 25% of people know that the data that they put in a SaaS tenant or in a cloud tenant, responsibility for having that data and a copy of that data relies with the people consuming the service, not with the cloud provider. Only 25% knows that. So 75% of people believe that Microsoft or Amazon or Google or Salesforce or Okta or Entra ID, that they keep a copy of their data somewhere and forever, and that whenever something happens, they will be able to recover. But it's not the case. These cloud providers, they have a shared responsibility model where they say, I am Microsoft. I am responsible to keep the Microsoft tenant up and working. I'm responsible that you can send and receive emails, that you can have a SharePoint site, which is accessible, Entra ID to allow people to authenticate themselves, or Okta in order to have a single sign-on service that is running. That service, the SaaS provider or public cloud provider, they will guarantee that that service is up and running. But the data that you put in these SaaS applications or in the public cloud, that's your responsibility as a company or a government organization. And you can do two things now. You can start to rely on some of the copy and restore functionalities, which are very bare bone in the cloud itself or at the SaaS provider itself. but then you're putting your eggs in the same basket. So this is what I was referring to earlier in our conversation. What if there's a big outage, like what happened to Amazon? You not only lose your SaaS application or your public cloud application, but you also lose access to your data or a capability of restoring. So that shared responsibility model is misunderstood. People take for granted that Microsoft or Google or Amazon or Salesforce or Jira or Confluence or Bamboo, like all these SaaS applications, that they will help them when their data is accidentally deleted, destroyed, encrypted. But that's not the case. Gartner has indicated that probably in a couple of years, in three years, 75% of people will realize it. So then people will start to understand, I need to have a proper strategy for having a platform that allows me to keep a copy of that data in a secure place, which is independent from these cloud providers and SaaS providers. So that when I'm in my darkest hour and things fall apart, then I have a warm and cozy feeling that I have somebody by my side who can help me to access my data and restore it. That takes specialization. So SaaS and cloud, it's a shared responsibility model, and people don't realize that enough.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm earlier this week, and there were so many companies that went into panic mode because they didn't know what was happening, right? It's such a common assumption that cloud equals safety, but clearly the reality is more nuanced than that. You've shared a real world example of where dependency on hyperscaler caused issues, but how have you seen an independent infrastructure help mitigate that risk?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you a few examples. In 2024, there was a large Australian company that lost all of their data because a Google employee accidentally wiped their entire account. So they even had some information that they were backing up within that account, within that Google account. However, all the eggs were in the same basket. And it's not intentionally that this happened. This happens accidentally. But the whole environment was completely wiped. So they didn't have access to their Google workspace anymore and all the data that was associated to it. So there's an example where they were relying on Google, but luckily they had a third-party backup and restore solution to help them recover. So same in the US, for example, one of our customers in the US, a US government supplier, has also been involved in a very large-scale ransomware attack by the Conti gang. So the Conti ransomware hit them very badly, and it actually wiped away their entire SharePoint environment in this case. So the first example was Google. This is an example where the SharePoint environment Microsoft SharePoint was completely wiped. SharePoint was the way to collaborate, and it was also attached to some business processes or processes that had to do with public services, which is, of course, government's business. And they were not able to operate anymore, meaning that all these government agencies that were depending on this supplier, they stopped working. And sometimes when a business goes into grinding to a halt, it's annoying because your customers, they cannot consume your goods and services anymore. But when a government supplier stops operating, it's public services that are affected, which means the health of people, the support of people, maybe the payment of pensions, maybe medical services, maybe urgency services. So you can quickly see how bad it can go in a ransomware attack like the Conti ransomware attack that happened to this supplier, what the consequences could be. Now, they were able to recover within 30 minutes. Why were they able to recover within 30 minutes? Because they took the precaution to not rely on the hyperscalers or the SaaS applications to do the backup and recovery for them. They rely on Keepit, making sure that they have their data in a US data center, 0 subprocessors, secret, nobody can see it, air-gapped, from all the other cloud providers so that it cannot be infected, immutable so that nobody can change it, so that they can rest assured the moment that a Conti ransomware attack encrypts everything, they don't have to pay the ransom. They don't have to panic.
I think that's such an important clarification. So many business leaders still underestimate those gaps in shared responsibility, and you just cover that so well. Now, not everything is dull and gloom, right? So let's talk about the upside. Beyond the risk mitigation, what strategic advantages can organizations gain by diversifying their infrastructure or using independent backup clouds?
Yeah, sure. I think, of course, there's risk, as you said, with regards to something bad that can happen with a very bad impact and a high probability, like a ransomware attack or a mass deletion, big impact. You try to hedge that risk with an independent cloud, as I've just explained. But there's more goodness than just that, right? So, for example, people would like to get easy access to emails that are stored or that have been created and deleted 20 years ago because they are in a investigation, a litigation case, or legal says like, hey, I need to be able to do some analysis and some auditing on some emails that were exchanged 20 years ago. Those emails are no longer in the active tenant. They're gone in the active tenant. So even though you have not been hacked, you did not have a mass deletion going on, you want to be able to say like, okay, show me the emails that have been traded on that topic 20 years ago between these constituents. That's something that you can do when you have a independent cloud where you keep all the data and you keep it almost forever. In a public cloud environment, you're not able to do that. The reason why is that the cost of storage and keeping data forever in public cloud is too high. There's actually a flaw in their business architecture to provide a predictable cost and price for storing information for a long time. So at Keepit, because we have an independent cloud, we are not relying on storage costs, which are rising all the time in public cloud. We have complete control over our own infrastructure and our own storage costs, which is predictable and flat over time. So we can keep information for 99 years. 99 years. Without providing an additional burden of cost to the end customer. So this may sound like, well, storage cost, is it about cents and dollars and so on? But when you are a large company and you have petabytes of data, it starts to matter a lot. So next to the risk, there are other use cases where you want to have access to data which is 5 years old, 7 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old. So when you then have a solution that can take a copy of your data in an independent cloud, which is not relying on the expensive storage costs that are in public cloud environments, you're able to provide way more goodness and way more features and functions and things that your end customers can enjoy without increasing the cost. So I believe that being able to be independent also gives you a business model that you can keep the data for quasi 100 years, as I said, without having to increase the cost to your end customers, which is impossible when you're relying on public cloud.
I think that's good because it actually gives businesses real advantages, like you've explained now. But if we had to say a CIO or CISO is listening right now and wants to strengthen their cyber resilience strategy, where would they have to start?
That's a good question. So let me put forward a rule of thumb that we always use when we are in conversations with CISOs and CIOs that take a macro level on their company. Mostly they're interested in risk, revenue, and cost. How can I assure that we have a growing revenue stream? How can I assure that our information systems allow us to reduce our cost? And how can I reduce the risk of an interruption or an impact? Now, what we advise CISOs is the first thing that you should do is you should map all the applications that you have and that are attached to revenue streams. What are the applications that are powering revenue streams? And which applications need to stay in place to have a minimum viable company? So that when something happens and you are overwhelmed by a large-scale cyber attack, or you are overwhelmed by a accidental mass-scale deletion or corruption of data, that you already know what are the applications that constitute my minimal viable company. What you see is that most companies, larger companies, they use on average 120 SaaS applications. 120. So the first step is to look at these applications, look at which applications are part of my minimal viable company and are attached to revenue streams, so that you know where you have to start your prioritization of the applications that have the highest impact if something happens to them. That's the first step that needs to happen. Map all your applications, see what is attached to revenue streams, select those that constitute your minimal viable company. Map the applications, find out which ones are connected to revenue, prioritize those that are the minimal viable company, and then have a plan how you're going to protect these applications and test what happens if the application is down and how quickly you can recover. On average, if you don't have a good plan and test strategy for recovering SaaS applications, it takes you on average 3 to 4 weeks to recover. 3 to 4 weeks could be the difference between bankruptcy or survival. And protecting SaaS applications is a specialized domain. What we see is that a lot of backup providers that have grown from the data center, protecting virtual machines or Oracle databases, they started to also protect cloud workloads or SaaS applications. But two things happened. They did not have cloud experience, so they've built these backup solutions in the cloud, in Microsoft, in Amazon, in Google, right? And secondly, it's hard to understand all these SaaS applications, how they operate, how the APIs operate, how you get the data, how you understand the hierarchy of all the objects and so on, and how you restore in a good way. So when you're mapping your applications, select those SaaS applications that are most critical to your business, and then ask yourself, if they go down, how do I recover? And do I need to rely on the same cloud where the SaaS application is running? Or am I just trying to cover it with my traditional data center backup provider? If that's the case, then you need to create a new plan where you look at a specialized independent cloud provider that can help you with protecting SaaS applications in a proper way, where you have digital sovereignty, where you have no additional storage costs, how long you retain the data does not matter, and where you feel like, okay, I'm now independent. I have a warm and cozy feeling. So those are the 3 steps for CISOs.
I think that's a lot of useful advice for our audience to take away. Thank you so much, Jan, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Trisha. I really enjoyed the conversation as well, and I find it very valuable and meaningful. I appreciate it.
So if anything, this is a powerful reminder that resilience isn't just about where your data lives. It's about who controls it and how quickly you can recover it. Thank you to our audience for tuning in to another episode of Tech Transformed. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Follow us at EM360 Tech on X and LinkedIn, and visit our website at em360tech.com for more expert insights. Until next time, stay curious and stay ahead of the trends.